Howdy, howdy. Welcome to the Dixiecryptid channel. Welcome to Marathon 88. We've got 2 Bigfoot stories and 2 Dogman stories. All right, I'm going to quit blabbering. Let's get on with this video. Hope y'all enjoy it. All right, here we go. Here's a story from Australia from Jim. I'm 60 years of age and I live in a suburb on the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia. At the rear court that I live in, there's a large parkland covering over 200 acres. This parkland separates our estate from the local beach on the perimeter of Port Phillip Bay. I work locally and daily ride a push bike along the paths leading through the parkland to the beach and onwards to my place of employment some 15 kilometers away. For 8 years, I would exit my driveway, ride up the road for 35 meters and turn right into a pathway entrance situated between 2 houses and begin my ride to work. That journey was interrupted 2 years ago, and while I still ride to work, I no longer go through the parkland. I now stick to the road all the way and take the longer but safer route. On a winter morning in 2016, I exited my house and made my way to the front gate in the usual manner, but I felt anxious for some reason. The magpies that usually greeted me with song from a tree at the front of my property were silent, and while I always started my journey in the pitch black of night, this time I felt trepidation and I wondered irrationally if I should drive to work today. There was something else strange about this night. In the distance, emanating from the area of the path entrance, was an increasingly louder asthmatic growl. At this point, I'd like to say that I've never in all my days experienced anything like I'm about to describe. I have hunted, camped, and lived in the forested areas along our coast and inland districts. The wildlife that I see is always expected: kangaroos, koalas, and snakes, etc. I stopped and allowed my eyesight to focus on the entrance to the pathway leading to the parkland, as I was sure it was the source of the rasping, but couldn't see anything exiting onto the road. So I waited. Finally, I decided it must be an old large dog that had been brought to heel by its owner, therefore safe for me to proceed on my bike journey. I pressed the crank into action and started cycling along the road with a view to entering into the park, inquisitive as to the type of dog that I would see. As I came closer to the creature, I veered to my left in order to sweep right into the park entrance when I was stopped dead. I had caught sight of the dog, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen. First, there were no owners in sight. The dog was laying down 10 meters from the entrance, as if it was lying in wait. When it saw me, it rose on all fours and began prowling towards me, but not like an ordinary dog. This was big, really big. Its head was double the size of a Labrador's, but more rounded. Its height was that of a Shetland pony, and its width was 4 or 5 feet. Its arms were muscular, so much so that it had to roll and splay them in order to move forward. It was dark brown in color, moving in the shadowy moonlight, and its eyes glowed orange. I have a scientific background, and funny as it seems, the conundrum of its eyes glowing without any source of illumination from the environment around it intrigued me, and I dare say rooted me in place. As it came to the front of the entrance, 6 meters away from me, I remember overcoming my curiosity and exclaiming, "F this," or something of that nature, and began furiously pedaling along the road. My bike has an electric function, and with some post-purchase modifications, it can reach speeds up to 40 miles per hour fairly quickly, and it sure did that day. I never looked back, and I didn't stop until I was a block away to catch my breath. I then rode all the way to work using the road, not venturing onto the park at any stage. I contacted the local ranger later that day and asked if they had any reports of large stray dogs in that area, and he replied no. So I left it at that. I happened to be watching YouTube earlier this year, and your channel came across my feed. When I heard your stories about the Dogman, I finally had a name for what I had seen. I don't want to see this thing again. I ceased riding my bike to work until summer that year, and although I still ride today, I never go into the parkland, and I refrain from riding during the winter. I think it's about all I can recall, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can also feel free to modify the report to fit your narrative style. God bless you all. Jim, thank you very much. I remember that you had sent me this email several months ago, and for some reason you had just stopped. I don't know. I'm just guessing. I'm making big assumptions here, but I'm wondering if writing it scared you so bad you just had to stop. But maybe you were interrupted. I don't know. But you did finish it. Jim did finish it. I asked him to finish it, and he sent it to me. And this is the first Dogman story I've ever heard of from Australia. And I love my Australian friends. They're so nice to me on this channel. I just want to give them a big shout out and a wave. Way down there in the southern hemisphere, looking at the Southern Cross at night, out in the outback. I would love to visit Australia someday, but I'm not sure what part of the country I'd want to spend my time. Maybe the desert, maybe the jungles, I'm not sure. But it's a beautiful country, very nice people. And Jim, thanks for sending the story. Here's a Dogman encounter from Florida. The writer's name goes by Jay. I write to you today after giving a great deal of thought about a very intense encounter that happened in the winter of 1991. My older brother by 2 years and I attended college together at the same time and in the same class since we served 2 years active duty in the U.S. Army before we both enrolled as freshmen in 1989. We lived in Daytona Beach, Florida at the time, and we were both attending college in Ohio from 1989 to 1993. I was a pre-med business student and a collegiate athlete. My brother is a U.S. Army reservist and a musician. We weren't partiers or troublemakers. We were your normal, average college students. We were returning from our Christmas break in Florida, making the 14-hour drive back to Ohio in time to have a Sunday off to unwind and prep for classes at 8 the next Monday morning. I actually don't even know if I truly believed in Bigfoot then, but I certainly do now. I had never heard of Dogman until just very recently as a result of your channel. My brother told me about your YouTube channel about 8 weeks ago. He and I were discussing an episode of your show, and the memory came to both of us as if it happened a few hours ago. It was very vivid and so real. What I'm about to share with you happened to him as the driver of the car and us because I was in the passenger seat. Recounting this story to you over the keyboard brings me goosebumps as I type. It was a cold night. There was snow on the sides of the road, some ice patches from time to time, but for the most part, the roads were clear. My brother was moving along at about 70 miles an hour. The window cracked open just a bit to balance out the heat from the defrost and the heater. We had not seen a car for some time going in either direction. Both he and I were drawn to look over to the left lanes because a very large wolf-like animal bounded once from the median towards our lane. This was a 4-lane highway, and the animal needed just one jump to cover the 20-plus feet to enter our side of the highway. Its jaws were wide open as it leapt towards our car. Now keep in mind, this is happening in the time it takes for us to close the distance of 500 or so yards at 70 miles per hour. Even with him slowing down out of sheer shock at the size of this creature, just a few seconds was all it took. And then the creature stopped and stood on the median. It crouched a bit and jumped over the 2 lanes on its side of the highway, literally right into the oncoming lane that we were on. It was within a foot or two of hitting us. Eyes as wide as silver dollars, we looked at each other and said, if we were in one voice, "Did you see that?" Our adrenaline was kicked in, the hair on our arms standing straight up, and our senses were on alert as we realized what had just happened. I turned around to look out the back window, and in the red glow of the brake lights, I saw the creature. It was easily 4 feet tall at its back and 8 to 10 feet in length from nose to tail. Its head was massive, and it stood another 2+ feet above the backbone. It was 3/4 broadside, so I was able to see just how massive this thing was. We immediately thought of wolf or coyote only because that is the only animal that we could think it resembled. This was no wolf or coyote, though. It was massive. My brother and I went back and forth for the rest of the trip trying to identify it. It looked much more like a werewolf that you would read about in the comic books or see in a movie. After listening to the Dogman stories on your channel, I could not help but think that this massive beast we saw that cold December night was a Dogman. We now discuss Bigfoot regularly, and we both believe that these creatures exist. I'm going to give credit to you and your subscribers for sharing their encounters. It is not always easy. My brother and I never told anyone in our family about that creature because nobody would believe us. Even now, when we're together and the topic of Bigfoot comes up, our family members are split evenly between the believers and the doubters. We have an older brother who is 100% convinced that Bigfoot is indeed very real. He moved to the mountains in Utah about 6 years ago, and he says the reality is palpable. So many folks with encounters on your channel share, and that takes courage. You can call me Jay as you share this story with others. Thank you for the venue to express our encounter from 1991. God bless you and be well. Signed, Jay. Jay, thank you so much for that story. For some reason, we don't get a huge amount of Dogman stories, but this one is really good. I mean, you got a great look at it. It was huge. I mean, you described it all in the story. I just thought it was a great story. This Dogman phenomenon is very interesting, and I'm always wondering what in the world these things are. Thanks, Jay, for the email. Here's an email from a man named Chris from Ontario. Being a cab driver in a small Ontario city just under 100,000 people means that you get out-of-town calls fairly regularly. Drop-off and pickups a half hour away are common. Up to 3 hours away, maybe one every other month. Once a year or so, at least one driver will get a call 5 hours or more away. You wouldn't believe the company record, but that's another story. I've been lucky enough to get a handful of long-distance calls over the 7 years that I've been a cabbie. The office knows that unlike most of the other drivers, I enjoy the long rides, especially the part of the trip when I'm alone, just me and the music. I've also been lucky in that the customers on those long trips have been mostly pleasant, and the entire ride with each was uneventful, except for the last one, that is. Dispatch got a call around 4 p.m. one afternoon from a woman that had to get home as soon as possible due to a family emergency, but the RV that her and her husband were using to tour the province to mark their recent early retirement had broken down, and the garage couldn't get the part for at least another day, so a cab was her only choice. I won't say where she was going beyond it being near the northwest corner of Algonquin Park. With her address programmed into my GPS, off we went. We chatted for the first half hour or so, and she explained that her father had fallen from his roof while fixing some shingles and had hurt himself badly. She didn't have all the details, but what she did have had her worried. She asked if I minded if she nodded off because she was going to be too busy to sleep once she got home. I assured her that it was quite all right, so the rest of the trip was made in silence, except for the radio, of course. It had been a hot August day, but by 8:30 in the evening it was very pleasant with a cool, light breeze that had blown away the day's humidity. My customer had woken up once we turned onto the fire route that led to her house. A washboard section of dirt road will do that. At around the 4-mile mark, halfway it turned out to be, we both saw a large black blur cross the road at the faintest edge of my high beams. "That's a good-sized bear," I commented. A nervous little, was all I got as a reply. I didn't inquire any further, assuming that bears frightened her. That's understandable. She had enough on her mind as it was. If you've ever driven on an interior fire route, you know that you can't go very fast on a lane and a half wide if you're lucky, hilly, winding dirt road, but also because of the abundance of wildlife, so I wasn't surprised in the least, and I was kind of expecting some. Not giving it another thought, I continued on to the customer's house. I helped her with her luggage and wished her father the best, and then got back in the van and I left. Going back up the fire route, I looked for a good spot to pull the van over, at least partially off the road, because nature was calling rather insistently. I know what you're asking. If you're on such a backwoods dirt road, why are you bothering to get out of anyone's way? Well, I figured that my customer wasn't going to be far behind me, and besides, the company I work for drills it into us, park out of traffic's way when picking up or dropping off people so that they aren't deluged with any more complaints than they already get. Really, though, it's just the polite thing to do. Anyway, it took quite a while to find a suitable spot, so when I did, I wasted no time turning the van off and getting out and over to the passenger side to take care of business. Feeling greatly relieved, I decided to have a smoke and soak in the peace and quiet for a few minutes and stretch before the 4.5-hour return home. Pacing slowly back and forth along the passenger side of the van, I noticed that my footsteps through the twigs and leaf litter were unusually loud, so I stopped and listened to absolutely nothing. There weren't even crickets chirping. It was weird. Finishing my cigarette, I turned to circle the back of the cab and dropped the butt onto the dirt, keeping my eyes down on it to make sure I stepped on it to grind it out. As I lifted my eyes, there was enough of a full moon shining through the tree canopy for me to see 2 gigantic, hairy feet just back from the opposite side of the road. I froze. Those weren't paws. These were definitely toes. A jolt of excitement shot through me. I'm seeing a real-life Sasquatch, I thought. Cold fear soon followed. I didn't hear it coming. The van was off, everything else was eerily silent, and I had not heard a thing. I slowly raised my eyes and saw calves as big as my thighs, and then thighs at least as big around as a car steering wheel. After noting that it was a male, I stopped when I was looking straight ahead into a hairy stomach. It's funny what can go through your mind during times of stress. I kept seeing clips from nature shows about gorilla behavior in the wild, hoping that these could be at least somewhat applicable. My curiosity and excitement beat out my fear, forcing my eyes to continue upwards. A barrel chest led into shoulders over 4 feet wide. As my eyes crept higher, they came to a long chin resting on little to no neck. Finally, our eyes met. I saw his thin lips part as he let out a long, low growl. My heart dropped into my stomach. Just then, a car came over the hill about 50 yards back to my left, illuminating the whole area. The Sasquatch took a step back, turned to look at the approaching car, finished the 180, and walked back into the dark of the bush in a few long strides, disappearing entirely. I couldn't turn my head away from the direction that the heavily muscled, hairy back had went until the car slowed to a stop in front of me. The passenger side window glided down, and I leaned over to see my customer. She had a very concerned look on her face as she asked, "Are you okay?" My brain seemed incapable of getting my vocal cords to work, so I just nodded. "Follow me out, okay?" Again, I just nodded. My body seemed to be moving on autopilot as I straightened up and finished the circle around the van, jumped in, and started it up. Pulling out behind her when she passed, I followed her out the country road. She stopped just short of the pavement and got out and walked back to the cab. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked after I rolled down the window. Finally able to speak, I nodded and I said, "Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much for showing up when you did. I don't know." "You're very welcome," she cut in, "but I really have to go. I'd love to discuss this with you, but I don't have the time. I have to go see my father." With that, she turned and walked back to her car, and off she went. I didn't follow right away, taking the time to set my GPS for the shop and to light a cigarette. To my surprise, my hands weren't shaking at all. That changed as I was putting the van into gear. An inhumanely loud howl split the air, sounding no more than 100 to 150 feet away. My blood almost stopped flowing as the transmission dropped into gear and I stomped on the pedal, throwing dirt and gravel out behind me in a rooster tail. I can take a hint. People find zen in their own ways. For me, it's driving long distances alone. Usually it does anyway. This time, not so much. I played the experience over and over during the drive back to the yard, making sure to secure every detail that I could to my memory. I am 5'11", and a level gaze had me looking directly into its stomach. I figure his height to be somewhere between 8'6" and 9 feet tall. His weight had to be at least 500 pounds. He wasn't proportioned quite like a human. The car headlights gave me a good enough look, albeit short, to see that his arms were longer than ours, with his fingers reaching past mid-thigh. The nails, and they were nails, not claws, were jagged like he spent a lot of time digging in rough terrain. The hair was dark, almost black, seeming longer on the shoulders and arms than elsewhere. His barreled chest slowly expanded and contracted with each enormous breath. The lung capacity must be staggering. His face was dark-skinned and hairless, giving me a good view of his thin-lipped, wide mouth, broad, flat nose, and deep-set eyes under a prominent but smaller brow ridge than I expected. I have the impression of him having a cone-shaped head, but I can't say for certain. His turn and walk into the darkness was amazingly fluid and graceful, even while taking strides twice as long as mine. By no means was he a lumbering giant. After giving it a lot of thought, I decided that he never really meant me any harm. My initial dread at the imagined reason for his stealthy approach was muted when I realized that if it did want to hurt me, it could have done so before I even knew it was there. I think that it only growled like that because I made direct eye contact with him. It remained as motionless as I had been, but I don't doubt that it was checking me out and must have come to the conclusion that I wasn't a threat and would not challenge him. His almost nonchalant manner he had when the car arrived left me thinking that he was quite familiar with the comings and goings around the area, and my customer was very familiar with him. By the end of the drive, I decided that I wouldn't tell anyone what happened except for my family. Well, I might have told one of the other drivers. At the very worst, he would think that it was a good story. As for my customer, I was tempted to get her phone number from the office, but ultimately decided against it. She had problems of her own and probably wouldn't want to answer a million of my questions. Imagine my surprise when a couple of weeks later, when I got into work, there was a message waiting for me. The office manager said that the customer had called to thank us for getting her home safely, and that since I had been so concerned about her father, that she wanted me to know that he had been touch and go for a week, but he was doing much better now. She had asked for my phone number and had understood when the dispatcher told her that he could not give the phone number out, but she insisted that he give me her number and to call her when it was convenient. We've since become good friends and we actually talk often. She has given me permission to write up her stories, so you'll probably be hearing from me a few more times at least. Here's a story from someone. It's a woman. She doesn't give me permission to use her name, so I'm not going to give it. But here's what she writes. This is a really good story. This story comes secondhand. It was my dad's encounter. He passed away in 2006, so I cannot ask him further questions. But on some occasions, there were times when we got around talking about this, his odd experience in the mountains of Washington State in 1959. He was a minister, a media specialist, a teacher, a police chaplain, a travel agent to all parts of the world, and he was an author. He had degrees in archaeology and anthropology, and he led an exciting life full of myriads of places and people, but he never told me of anything else as remotely weird as like this. When I think of my dad back in the 50s, from all the stories and photographs, what comes forth is a quintessential naturalist, someone totally at ease in nature. The old pictures show him clamming expertly in the deep fog along the sandy Puget Sound or hiking to the peaks of most all the mountains with road access in the Olympic and Cascade Ranges, both the famous and the obscure alike. His favorite activity in a state that offered so much was in the winter climbing to high peaks in his Alaskan Cowichan sweater, rich in lanolin, a dark brown Thunderbird on a cream background, warm and impenetrable to the cold, and his prize Austrian skis and boots garnered from a backpacking trip in the Alps. After years of saving money as the assistant to a small Seattle butcher in high school, and then high up after a long day of climbing, he would let loose and ski all the way down. He loved doing this and would sometimes bring a friend along, but usually he went alone, leaving his house around 3:30 or 4 a.m. and getting to his targeted spots around sunrise. One early winter morning, he was up on Mount Eleanor along the Olympia Peninsula. No one was around as he pushed off the snowy peak, stopping and leaning on his ski poles early on his way down the dramatic incline to admire the breathless beauty of seemingly endless scenery all around him. It began to snow lightly. He was continuing standing off to the other side down from the main peak when he sensed that maybe there was something around it. It was a sixth sense sort of thing, and he looked up at the peak from where he had just come. There, off to the right and above, was someone coming up over the hill. He said it happened really fast, but his first thought was, oh, fun, another skier, which was super rare back in those days and had never happened to him, but it was possible. And then as the creature came closer, he saw it, and it seemed to have fur in its outline as it bent down low and leaned forward into the wind for the best aerodynamic effect. And my dad said that he assumed he was comically witnessing a bear skiing, totally oblivious to my father's presence. He said he was just about to burst out laughing. Bears can be dangerous, as we all know, but hilarious and fun of antics too. And as he observed it some yards away, sliding down and gaining speed, seemingly oblivious to all around but his or her own fun. After passing my dad, it slowed down, though still bent and skiing, and its head turned around slowly and quite deliberately to stare from eyes in a face that were neither bear nor human, directly into the eyes of my father for the deep and meaningful flick of a second. He was letting my dad know that it had known of its presence the whole time. This is when everyone listening would get the willies so bad, and when I was a little girl, I would have to run around to expend the energy of the willies, shouting, "It was the abominable snowman!" And he did occasionally wonder for the rest of his whole life, with no answer in sight, as to just what it was that he encountered on that faraway mountaintop in Washington State on that cold winter morning. Oh, that was a good story. I don't think we've got any stories quite like that. That was awesome. Thank you so much for sending that. And it sounds like your dad was an awesome guy. I really love this story. Thanks. Thank you very much for watching my video. I certainly appreciate it. And we'll see you guys on the next one. Hopefully I'll get another one out this weekend at some point. All right, you guys have a good weekend. Talk to you soon.